Hello, welcome to week two's lecture about invasion of North America. So we're going to start off, we'll just jump right in. So the first group of Europeans to make its way over to North America were the Vikings. This first voyage took place in about 1000 CE, and you can see here on the map the different paths that the Vikings went on. Making their way over to Iceland, making their way over to Greenland, and then eventually over into Canada, what we know as Canada today, North America. So what we know about this voyage over to North America is that it wasn't very successful. So the Vikings did treat the indigenous people in this area quite poorly, taking foods from them, taking villages and whatnot. They tried to grow foods that they were used to growing in their home country, which didn't work out too well with the climate and the landscape they were trying to grow them in. So, trying to raise cattle as well, it was just too cold to do these things where they were headed. So they quickly abandoned. It is widely thought that if they had treated the native people better, or if they had been more flexible in the crops and what sorts of animals they were bringing with them, they may have fared better. But we'll never know. So this was not a success. So if we think about what was going on in Europe right around the time that people start making their way over later on, when we think of the 1450s, most Europeans did live off of the land, so they were doing agricultural work. There were a lot of food shortages, so there were periods of drought, there was a little ice age that happened, there were years with many bad crops, there was also a lot of warfare going on. And when technology is not super good and the transportation is not ideal, then whatever low agricultural products, whatever low number that they're actually harvesting, don't get transported very far anyway. So there's a definite food shortage. As you can see, there is an unhealthy population, so about 1/4 of children did not make it past 1 year old. 40 was considered a ripe old age to live to, and society was heavily stratified as well. Stratified is one of our universal concepts, meaning that this society is broken down into different groups. So upper class, middle classes, lower classes. So there are definitely monarchies in Europe, and then nobility under the monarchies, and lots of different steps in this hierarchy. So nobility made hundreds of times more money than commoners and peasants, and that's similar to what we have going on in our society today. We have the very, very, very wealthy and then the very poor and impoverished people. One thing that goes a little bit contrary to, I think, what we've learned about is that typically monarchs were not as powerful as the local lords that were technically underneath them. And so these local lords tended to have more money, more troops, more land sometimes, and could sort of bend the different monarchs to their will. This would change later on, but in the 1400s, that was largely the case, not the Cape. So, law enforcement wasn't ideal, so there was a lot of murder, rape, theft. Society was just pretty hectic and chaotic at this time. And one thing that you may know about that did change society quite a bit is the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, which reoccurred several times in Europe. But the peak, the biggest outbreak, was in the 1300s, so about 1340s to 50s, where it killed about 1/3 of Europe. And then there were recurrent outbreaks as well. Why do I have a squirrel, you might be wondering? That is because squirrels still, in North America, carry bubonic plague. As a park ranger, I was always yelling at people to not touch squirrels. And a couple years ago, we even had a few people who got plague from squirrels. So now you all know, do not touch squirrels, please. So while this plague is thought of being awful, it did affect agriculture and commerce in an interesting way. So it did free up some resources. People started making more money because it wasn't overpopulated. But there were negative effects. There were violent religious movements that took place. Back then, people had no idea how plague was spread. And so they often attributed that to supernatural and religious beliefs. And so we have things, different religious persecutions going on, blaming different groups for these sorts of outbreaks that were occurring. But like I said, there were benefits as well. So higher wages, a dropping in the price of foods, more land was opened up, so it did sort of change economics a little bit for the better there. Okay, so eventually people decided they needed to find some different ways to go, different areas to explore. One thing that made this possible was an improvement in trade and transportation. Especially encouraged by the freeing up of resources. We started to have people investing in new technologies, new trading ventures. So there were economic factors, trying to find new trade routes, and because technology was improving, like I said, that was made possible. There were also political factors. So, that famously, England and France were rivals, and Spain as well. Trying to gain more power and more influence on different areas was another factor in trying to find new lands. And then, because technology was improving, we had tools so that navigating long distances overseas became possible. So new navigational tools, shipbuilding, gunpowder, all these items made it so that it was more likely to have a successful mission. All right. So in the 15th century, while I think a lot of people think that Europe was the more powerful area of the world, it definitely was not. So we've talked about how Europe was unruly, it was vulnerable, there was the plague outbreak, there were nobles fighting with each other and fighting with their monarchs. China, on the other hand, was the wealthiest and the most powerful nation in the 15th century. So they had this famous treasure fleet that would go around with hundreds of vessels. They made seven famous voyages in which they took all their Chinese luxury goods, spices, silks, different bone or ivory, and they would trade it far and wide, and they made so much money off of that. So they were quite wealthy. The Ottoman Empire, they were powerful in a military sense. So they had the best trained military, they had the most populous military, and they controlled all trade routes going between Europe and Asia or Africa. So they were able to get quite a bit of income from that as well. Europe, again, kind of a hot mess over there, isolated, depending on the Ottoman Empire to be able to trade for these luxury goods. Okay. So, European expansion did start with the desire to trade directly with West African markets instead of going through the Ottoman Empire's trade routes. So the first nation to start doing so was Portugal. And that's an important thing to know, so you want to make sure you have that down somewhere. So the three main objectives for Portugal were challenging Muslim power. So they wanted to spread Christianity and kind of have these different Muslim powers in West Africa and the Ottomans sort of become a little less powerful, doing so through trade routes. They wanted to make Christian allies with Ethiopia, who was a Christian nation in Africa. And of course, they wanted gold. So Portugal started challenging sailors and engineers to figure out how they could make a sea voyage possible all along the African coast. And one thing that made this possible is this ship that you see here in the photo. This is called a caravel. And a caravel was a new, light, more maneuverable ship, so it fared better in strong winds and strong seas. It was able to more quickly navigate. So this ship was able to start sailing to Africa and back, these ships. And so as they did so, Portugal, made its way further and further down the West African coast, paying tribute, which means sort of like paying rent to different leaders in the areas to establish trading posts and forts, and so they could maintain trade along that coast. And so some of the items they traded most for were gold, ivory, pepper and spices, and then eventually enslaved people from Africa. And of course we know where that goes. So just to briefly talk about that. To be clear, slavery has always existed and still exists. Oh, my alarm's going off, how rude. Okay. So the first cargo of enslaved people from Africa arrived in Portugal in 1441. And slavery in Africa was quite different than what we know of American slavery. So the status of being enslaved was not an inherited status, so it didn't pass down to children. So typically, well, for everyone at first in Africa, if they were enslaved, basically that just meant they were a prisoner. So they were a criminal, they were in a prison, and they were performing labor. And because they were prisoners, they could be sold. And eventually this would morph, to kidnapping people, finding innocent people who are easy to prey on and taking them and then imprisoning them. And it becomes shadier and shadier. But at first, these were prisoners. In medieval Europe at the time, the system that we think of as slavery was not really the same. So they had what was called serfdom, and that basically meant that there was a lord who owned a bunch of land, and commoners and peasants would live on that land, and in exchange for having a small piece of land, they would give a portion of their crops that they grew, typically about half, to the lord whose land they were living on. So they weren't being paid for the labor, a lot like sharecropping that we know of. And then sugar happened, and when sugar really became popular, that's when the amount of enslaved people from Africa really started rising in Europe and in the Americas. So sugar was discovered, sugar had been around for a while in the Middle East, but it was discovered by Europeans during the Crusades. And so this was in 1099. And it took a while to catch on. Sugarcane is really labor intensive. It's unpleasant, very unpleasant to work in a sugarcane field. It required a lot of land to grow this. And so eventually these Spanish and Portuguese sailors found some islands in the Eastern Atlantic. They now had access to enslaved people. And so they took these islands, they put sugar on it, they had enslaved people working on them, and this really started the sugar craze, sugar boom. So clearly everyone loves sugar. We're going to pause there because, as you know, I only get 15 minutes a session, and we'll pick up in a few minutes in part 2. Take a break, stretch, get a snack. We'll be back in a minute.